Recording with external microphone. System sound volume set to 100%.
Hello everyone. This is my third voice note to you. And before we carry on from where we left, you see, there is a piece of information, a clarification, and an addition. Um, First, I would like to tell you one of the most famous works of Edmund Spenser. You see, we talked of Edmund Spenser in case of Renaissance. So his most famous work is called Fairy Queen. Please note the spelling Faery, Fairy, Quene. Now, this final E was later on dropped. The English orthography actually came into existence after Donne. So, until the time of Donne, this final E was used in words like sun, moon, and so on. So, this fairy queen. Secondly, in the last voice note, I said that Milton died soon after the Restoration period in 1960. So, please be clear about it here that actually Restoration took place in 1660. I said 1660, and uh, maybe here I have said 1960. Don't get confused by that. Milton, in fact, died in 1670s. So be clear about it. Number one, Restoration took place in 1660. Number two, Milton passed away in early 1670s. This means that, I mean, Milton passed away shortly after the Restoration, which occurred in 1660. And thirdly, please mark the spelling of Augustan, Augustan, Augustan age, which we have discussed in case of Pope and Dryden. And then King Augustus, that's Augustus, Augustus. So now let's come to what we call the pre-Romantic poets. This era in English poetry begins from 1745 and continues up to 1798. Now, there were poets like Collins, Colins, Cooper, Couper, Robert Burns, Burns, and Thomas Gray. These are all grouped as pre-Romantic poets. These poets showed a gradual shift from the neoclassic. I mean, from the neoclassics, that is, Pope and Dryden. Their poetry, showed personal element. It was no more confined to social and political issues only. They also tried to violate, they also tried to break free from the rules of prosody, which were strictly observed in case of the classicism, that is neoclassicism. And Thomas Gray composed an elegy, which is called Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, in which he mourned or lamented the deaths of the common man, for whom there is nobody to lament the death. And this elegy also has personal element. It's quite different from Milton's Lycidas, Lycidas, Lycidas. This is also an elegy written in the pastoral tradition, so it's called pastoral elegy. But Gray's elegy is quite different from it. Anyway, the problem was that these poets could not completely break the shackles, and therefore they cannot be branded as romantic poets. There was another poet called William Blake, who is in our course, and he almost broke free, completely free from the the shackles imposed on the poetry by the neoclassic poets. He was against all kinds of rules and abstract reasoning and materialism of his time. Some critics and historians believe that he is a romantic poet. Others say that no, he is a pre-romantic poet. Anyway, we'll talk more about Blake when we come to Blake himself. Now, sorry. You see, this era is known as pre-romantic era. Gradually, the romanticism was developing. That is why some critics say that romanticism was not a revolution but an evolution, that which developed gradually. Now, with this, we come to romanticism. You see, by the way, 18th century was a century of revolutions. In 1776, we had American Revolution with Magna Carta. In 1789, we had the French Revolution, and in 1798, there was the beginning of Romantic Revolution. Now, in 1798, in fact, Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and William Wordsworth jointly published a collection of poems called Lyrical Ballads. And at that time, they were so frightened of the reaction that they escaped to Germany. There was a strong reaction. It was heavily criticized. But later on they came back to England, and gradually things improved, and the romantic poetry was recognized later on as great poetry, and it influenced generations to come. You see, French Revolution had in fact generated high hopes of freedom, equality, fraternity, liberty, and so on. Now, the Romantic poets completely broke free from the shackles of rules and discipline imposed on the poetry by Pope and Dryden. They introduced personal element in their poetry. They used nature, picked up images and symbols from nature, and used them as symbols to express their ideas. And for them, the deepest things came from their own self. So the man for the Romantics was a microcosm. Micro is a prefix in the sense of small, and cosm, C-O-S-M, cosm, is for cosmology, that is universe. So man was a microcosm, means that there was the entire universe hidden in a man, in the poet itself. They expressed personal feelings and desires, disappointments, hopes, fears, likes, dislikes, but they universalized it. So their poetry carries a strong universal appeal. You see, Wordsworth presented nature as supernatural. Coleridge presented supernatural as natural. And Keats developed his own concept of beauty. Shelley, on the other hand, was a revolutionary. For him, the west wind became a symbol of change and revolution. Byron was a bit different. He composed satires. He was, very sort of talented as far as writing satires were concerned. Even for Wordsworth, he used a phrase called long-eared laureate. Long-eared, who has a long ear? It's a donkey who has a long ear. Anyway, but Wordsworth, it was for Byron that he was like that, but actually he wasn't. Coleridge and Wordsworth belonged to the older generation of the Romantic poets, and Keats, Shelley, and Byron belonged to the younger generation of the Romantic poets. They looked to the noble savage, they drew inspiration from Greek poetry and from the medieval romances and from the Elizabethan poets. You know, uh, the focal point of the romantic poetics is self-expression, that is expressing themselves, as I've already told you. And in their poetry, references to nature, of course, they bring out the scenic beauty of nature, but that's not all. You know, there is always underlying meaning. There is always hidden meaning, implied meaning, when they describe nature. So, you know, they did not follow the strict rules of, for example, writing an ode or a sonnet, etc. And they were influenced, as I said, by medieval romances. You may have come across a reference to magic casements in Ode to a Nightingale. And when we take up Coleridge, you will see that there is a lot of influence of romance on Kubla Khan, the poem in our course. So, you see, romanticism is, I mean, there are various definitions of romanticism, and it's often described as the renaissance of wonder and mystery. That is, in the poetry of the romantics, you always find an element of wonder and mystery, and uh, you know, their love of freedom and the kind of imagery that they used, the symbols that they utilized, um, all these things were quite different from the neoclassic poets. And their poetry, you know, was in a way the poetry of common man, where you can see yourself. So, you know, this particular era, that is romanticism, continued up to 1838, from 1798 to 1838. Now this brings us to Victorian age. Victorian age in English literature begins in 1838 and ends exactly in 1900. That's the time of Queen Victoria. That's when Queen Victoria ruled Great Britain. So we had three major poets: Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, and Matthew Arnold. Now, remember, Lord Tennyson was a court poet at that time, and two major events in the 19th century had a great influence on literature. One was Industrial Revolution. You see, the British society was basically agricultural. There were lords and ladies, counts, countesses, esquire, and knights, and so on. Now, Industrial Revolution, because of that, many people migrated to the cities, and landlords found it difficult to get anyone to work in the fields. So it affected the entire economy, it affected the literature as well, especially fiction, not so much the poetry. The other occurrence was the publication of Origin of Species early in 1850s. This gave a huge jolt to Victorian faith. That is, intellectuals during the Victorian era were all very religious. But since they were intellectuals, they could not deny the science also. In Origin of Species, Darwin argued that the development of one of the species of the birds gives him the clue that our ancestors were apes and monkeys. He himself was not so sure. And now, of course, this theory has been rejected. But at that time, it was very much the word of the moment. Now, the intellectuals, they were divided into two groups. One favored religion, the other science. Robert Browning was all for religion, and his poetry was full of optimism. Lord Tennyson, on the other hand, offered a compromise between science and religion. Arnold was a skeptic. You see, skeptic is one who is confused. SCEPTIC, skeptic. He couldn't decide which way to go, and his poetry reflects that. Sorry. So these were the Victorian poets, and as far as poetry was concerned, they almost followed the Romantics, but they did not have the charm, the lyricism, the beauty, and the attraction of the Romantics. Now, there are two other, I won't say developments, but two other aspects which need your attention. There was a school of poetry called Pre-Raphaelites. 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 Raphael was a painter, and the intellectuals or the poets or painters who lived before Raphael, they were very religious in nature, and these pre-Raphaelite poets followed them. That is why they are called pre-Raphaelites. One such poet is D.G. Rossetti. Rossetti. D.G. Rossetti. They used a lot of symbols and imagery in their poems. And another development was Hopkins. Hopkins. Hopkins was a poet, and he is called the forerunner of modern poetry. But his poetry was also religious, very religious in nature. But the way he presented his poetry, very eccentric presentation of adjectival phrases and imagery. Because of that, he is considered to be forerunner of romantic poetry. Now, you see, I won't elaborate on these two because they have hardly any relevance to the course that you are expected to study. So we have come from 1745 to 1900 in this voice note. Now, you see, I'll close this voice note here, and I'll try to take up the rest of the poetry from here in the next voice note. Let's see. Well, till we meet again, it's goodbye from me. Be happy.
Play button disabled. Pause button.